Good morning, everyone. It's good to see so many familiar faces and a few new ones as well. This is the third session of Sunday Forum this fall, and we've got a great presentation for you today. I'll be introducing our esteemed presenter, Professor Mark Ginsburg, shortly. First, I'm Jeff Peckrell, and I'm with the Human Rights Working Group, along with Dolores and Melvin over there, who work to present these for you, arrange the speakers and whatnot in the Sunday Forum. And just want to mention that we mostly do Q&A at the end. We'd like to kind of keep it that way. There are some cards and pens scattered around the room. If you could write your questions down, then towards the end of it, Robin will collect those and we'll bring them up here and read them. And Professor Ginsburg will answer them. And I'll also be taking some from Zoom. We have some Zoom participants too. And I want to mention, he'll also say this, but we have a list of things that you can do to get involved in helping solve this horrible situation in Cuba, ending the blockade mainly. He's got this handout that you can take a copy. If you'd like to get involved, you can do that. There's also a petition here to have Cuba taken off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Very important to sign this, so please do that. I finally want to mention, like, next week, we have a very good presentation. I'll pitch this for you. Gene Felser will be covering some history of California that many people don't know about, its history as a slave state. So this should be a very, very interesting presentation. And now I'd like to have Dolores read our Ohlone recognition. Thank you.
We, the members of the First Unitarian Universal Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that our community is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working here, and we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. The Greater Bay Area is also the ancestral territory of the Miwok, Yokuts, Patwin, and other tribes. As the original stewards of this land, the indigenous peoples understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. We honor them now for their enduring commitment to our Mother Earth.
Thank you very much, Dolores. And so now for today, our topic is Cuba. I read an article in 48 Hills that Mark Ginsburg had written about attending a protest in DC, Washington, DC, that was held a month or two ago. And I said, this is a topic that we really need to have at a forum. I've taken a couple of trips to Cuba myself and know what a wonderful place it is, so unfairly treated. And this embargo that has been on for 50 years or so is absolutely ridiculous. It's creating a lot of human suffering. So we'll be learning about that today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Mark Ginsburg.
It's really a pleasure for me to be here and to meet people who are active on a whole range of issues. I'm hoping that you'll become even more involved in Cuba than you perhaps are at this stage. And certainly, I hope to provide some insights into what I call the economic and media war against Cuba. The embargo we'll talk about or blockade is actually more than 60 years old. And the only thing that's older than the blockade in my household is me. And it's really a crime against humanity in my view. We'll talk about that, but I also want to talk about the media war, because part of what the U.S. has been doing is not just trying to strangle Cuba economically, but trying to use propaganda to promote regime change. And we'll talk a little bit about that. In fact, talk about two fairly recent examples, one where it managed to mobilize a few hundred Cubans to go into the street, and another time where none of the Cuban population turned out, and it was in the same year. And then I'll end with a slide that is summarized in that handout, which you're welcome to pick up at the end if you want to have something physical to hold with the information on it of organizations that exist, but also maybe more relevant to you is upcoming activities and events which you can take part in either in person or online, which seems to be our reality most of the time these days. I want to start with what I call the economic war, the sanctions, or what I think more appropriately from a legal standpoint are unilateral coercive measures. This is not a UN set of sanctions. This is a U.S. government set of sanctions directed toward a country that has done the unimaginable thing of saying we are not going to be under the authority of the U.S. And there's a much longer history of U.S. attempts to control Cuba. We had troops there in earlier stages. This is before the Castro-led revolution, anyway, the longer history is also not very impressive in terms of what should have been, in my view, U.S. policy. I want to go through a lot of details, and you can see some of this. I'm citing other authors whose work I draw on, but I focus on 1960. This was before the blockade or embargo was put in place, but at a time that people within the U.S. government administration were already. Maybe let's move to the next slide if we can. Already beginning to worry about this development in Cuba, the revolution that succeeded. And a fairly prominent official in the State Department wrote a memo, which I think still characterizes U.S. policy. And he stated in this memo that it doesn't look like the people in Cuba are going to object to the new revolutionary government. So what we need to do is use every possible means to weaken the economic life of Cuba, denying money and supplies to Cuba in order to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of that government. So this goes back to 1960, and I would argue in some ways it's still the overriding policy. In the early 60s, Kennedy launched the embargo or blockade, and this began a process that it said is over 60 years in place of trying to carry out, if you will, the goals of the Mallory memo. Unless license, which is in Leo Grand's quote there, meant that the U.S. could decide not only who could trade with Cuba, but who could travel to Cuba. And those of you who have traveled know that there is a whole licensing process, which at times has been very restrictive and other times has not. I just want to mention that this is not just, a memo or an executive action. In 1992, and think about the context, right at the time when Cuba was dealing with the need to transition from its dependence on the Soviet Union, the Congress passed what was called the Cuban Democracy Act. I always love the titles of these legislations. And this began to legislate what had previously been only executive actions. In 96, probably the most formidable one co-sponsored by Helms and Burton, called the Cuban Liberty and Democracy Solidarity Act, basically took all of the executive orders and put them into law. The implications of this, of course, is that when Obama was in office and leaning, I don't know if he would have actually done away with the embargo. We can discuss that. But even if leaning in that direction, he had no authority to remove the blockade or embargo. It's a congressional vote, and that is a much steeper climb. More importantly, or equally important, the Helms-Burton bill had what is called Title III, which meant that people based in the U.S. could sue the Cuban government for properties that were nationalized during the after the revolution. And there have been some cases in court so far. There haven't been any jurisdictions, but one of them, affects the ports where cruise liners go, and various other aspects of the country that were taken over. And at least some legal scholars suggest that when you have a revolution and you nationalize properties, it is not a violation of international law. Moreover, Cuba offered to compensate all of the companies and individuals whose properties had been confiscated, but the U.S. government basically blocked that attempt to do it. Canada, England, various other countries got resolution of this issue afterwards. Again, why the U.S. government would do that, I'll leave to our discussion or your thinking. The embargo was bad enough in 2016, in my view, but through some process that I still don't understand, the population of the voting population in the U.S. elected a man named Donald Trump, and Trump decided that he wanted to be remembered as the one who really put the stranglehold on Cuba. He introduced 243 new sanctions against Cuba, specific items, but in a sense, plugging all the holes that he could find, or his team. I don't think he actually did the research, to tell you the truth. But the one thing he did, literally days before he walked out of the White House, some of you were probably celebrating that day, he put Cuba back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. To me, it's an absolutely bizarre designation. It existed before. Obama administration did a thorough review and decided it wasn't appropriate, but for a number of years it was on the books, and he put it back, and Biden hasn't taken it off. What this designation does, it's not just words, it makes it very difficult for banks and companies to do business with Cuba, because they potentially will be the target of sanctions by the U.S. government. And even if they're not target of sanction, many companies and banks are afraid to do so. So Cuba has its work cut out for us, even more so than without this SSOT. I brought a handwritten document petition. I can pass it around now, or we can maybe I'll pass it now. Those of you who would like to sign it, go ahead. And if you have questions afterwards, I'd be glad to discuss that more so. Biden has made a few changes. I must acknowledge and commend him for some of the minor changes that he has made, including trying to facilitate Cuban Americans to send money to their family. Trump decided that was a bad thing. Never quite made sense to me, since he was trying to recruit Cuban Americans to vote for him, but he did that. Biden administration also opened up some more airports that U.S. Passengers could fly to from the U.S. So it's made some difference. The remittances part hasn't made as big of a difference because, in fact, some of the companies that used to help transmit the remittances, what's the company that Western Union backed off doing business in Cuba because of the threats of the other parts of the legislation. And I have to admit that right now, those who are in the Republican Party, but also some Democrats, are trying to legislate the inclusion of Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. There's a Force Act, which is mentioned up here. I don't know if it's going to make it through the House. I think there's a better chance of that. It could also make it through the Senate. And to tell you the truth, I'm not sure that our current president has the stomach, let me put it that way, to take a stand and veto something if it came through. If this came through, it would take a vote of Congress to take Cuba off the list of state-sponsored terrorism. Right now, the president can do it with the stroke of the pen, literally. And that's what this million signature campaign that the petition is about. I just give you a little bit of the consequences of the blockade. I mean, first of all, our reputation internationally as a country is blemished, to put it mildly. Only 29 times in the last 30 years, there was, because of the pandemic, a skipping of a year of the vote. And it's about to happen next month as well. Almost unanimously, the governments of the world have condemned the U.S. blockade. And how does that make us feel as citizens of a country that the whole world basically thinks we're doing the wrong thing? More important, perhaps, if you're an elected official, a majority of U.S. population, and at least up until 10 years ago, I think there may have been some changes. I will talk about that. The majority of Cuban Americans think that U.S. should normalize relations with Cuba. So rumor has it we have a democracy in the U.S. If the majority of the people want to make a change in policy, it would just happen, right? Well, the evidence doesn't corroborate that. More striking is in 2021, at that point, $147 billion was the estimate of the damages made to Cuba, to the people of Cuba, and to their way of life, if you will. The next quote from the UN rapporteur, again, kind of reiterates the point of the impact of the embargo and the blockade. And as I said, the SSOT list only makes it worse than the other aspects of the policy. And one of the things that to me is just so, I was going to say obnoxious, maybe I'll use that word. The US government has tried to label the doctors who volunteer, Cuban doctors who volunteer to go around the world and provide medical care in the least accessible areas, in the areas that have the least provision of medicine. They've been likened to slaves, and that Cuba is being accused of trafficking medical doctors. There's 1 ounce of truth in this, in the sense that when Cubans travel outside the country, they don't collect all the fees that some governments pay. I mean, for a while, Brazil was doing it. It's now doing it again. Venezuela and others pay a fee for the services, but they don't go directly to the individual doctor. A portion of that ends up in the government coffers to provide healthcare, education, and other things that the Cuban government provides. And to tell you the truth, I wish our government could provide some of those. But the point being that when Cubans, medical personnel, doctors and nurses travel, they receive additional salary. They still maintain their salary that they would have if they didn't leave home, and then they get an additional bonus, if you will, on top of it. Do you consider that a form of slavery, of human trafficking? Your government does. I want to move on to media, and this is a photo of a relatively new center, an exhibit in a relatively new center in Havana, which I hope you'll have a chance to visit at some point. It's the Fidel Castro Center, which I think about 3 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, was opened. And it opened after he died because Fidel was very resistant to any kind of personal imaging of him, and they didn't consult him because he had already passed. But the Cuban people wanted to honor him. But anyway, this is an incredible museum. This is just one section of it, looking at the media war. For those of you who are not fluent in Spanish, and this is the section of, you know, what does the war consist of? How does it operate? What are its principal objectives? We'll kind of talk about that. I'm not trying to do justice to what that incredible exhibit does, but I want to give you some information. Again, this goes back, the media war goes back to 1960, when a radio, Cuba Libre, Radio Free Cuba, you might recognize that from its similarities with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union at that point. But this was an attempt to create a radio station to broadcast messages to people, because the US government was anticipating having a mercenary group invade Cuba. And the mercenary group was never going to be large enough to take over and end the Cuban government's operation. But the thought, in hindsight, very naive, that the Cuban population would rise up, join the mercenaries, and, you know, end the revolutionary government. Radio Swan was an attempt to send out messages to encourage people all over Cuba, and particularly in certain areas where they thought it would make a difference. Two different media efforts supported by the US government, our tax dollars, as if I need to remind you, Radio Marti and TV Marti. As you can see, in the mid 80s and early 90s, these were started. The cartoon on the upper right-hand side is a hero of mine and of many people around the world, not just Cubans. Jose Marti. He certainly wouldn't be in favor of these propaganda media outlets being named after him, but nonetheless they are. And as I said, it is not an inexpensive operation. And at the same time, it's an operation that has been demonstrated by U.S. government-funded research to be almost totally ineffective. So we broadcasting. So why continue to do it? Look at the people who receive the funds to do these broadcasts, and the Cuban American National Foundation and some of the anti-revolution Cuban Americans receive money, and in a way, it's, in my view, mainly trying to buy support. I mean, if the evidence suggests nobody's listening, why continue to do it? I don't know. A lot of questions I don't have good answers to. I'm sure you might. And, you know, broadcasting to Cuba is not that difficult, but in fact, you can't send TV messages just, you know, by sending them directly from a broadcast link in Florida. You need to have a system that connects with an airplane or some kind of balloon or something to relay the message, and we're paying for that as well. Let me look at corporate media for a moment. I'll leave to you the general view of the way U.S. media operates, whether it's all the news as fit to print, as the New York Times logo suggests, or not. But it's very clear in the case of Cuba that some of the reporting on Cuba is not without U.S. government support to the journalists who are writing things. And more generally, you know, those newspapers on Cuba lines, and maybe some others, you might argue, is reliably anti-Cuban. By the way, if anybody wants a copy of these slides with the details, or I can also share with you an article that was fairly recently published in the International Journal of Cuban Studies, which lays much of this out. The U.S. government has been trying to keep up to date, moving from just using you know, newspapers and radio and TV to social media. And in fact, they tried in 2010 to create a specific app, if you will, that Cubans would use to try to transmit messages favorable to the overthrow of the Cuban government. And again, I love the name, the National Endowment for Democracy, and USAID have supported these efforts. And we'll talk about some of the impact of social media, because increasingly Cubans have access to it. In 2010, well, unlike many parts of the world, there wasn't a lot of access, but there certainly was. This was an attempt, and I don't know, I guess I should have rewritten this and said it's an X-like app rather than a Twitter like app. But USAID also got into the game, and particularly, again, I have to commend and condemn at the same time people who were very knowledgeable. They knew that people of African descent and some of the youth were less satisfied. They had not lived through the pre-revolution period. They also suffered some of what I see as mistakes made by the Cuban government. And so they were seen as potentially a soft underbelly of the population that if they might be mobilized. And in fact, it turned out to be the case, not to the extent it was envisioned, but in 2021, on July 11th, and this event probably had more impact on the US than it did in other parts of the world, because the events of July 11th were immediately broadcast via all kinds of social media so that people could see some of the few images coming out of what happened in Cuba. To be very concrete, there were protest demonstrations in Cuba on July 11th in a number of cities. And I've talked to some of the people who have participated in them. I also have talked to many more who observed what was going on and didn't participate. In both groups were people who were suffering economically and were not satisfied with their daily life in many ways. But the majority of the people who didn't protest, and I estimate, I don't have any direct evidence, nobody's done the research, but a large portion of those who did demonstrate were not really about calling for an end of the Cuban Revolution, of regime change at that point in time. They were protesting what was not a good daily life for them, and they wanted changes. Some of them remembered that part of the problem Cuba was facing was not what was going on in Havana, but what was going on in Washington. But still, they wanted some actions, but some of it turned very violent. And what I think is quite amazing, given that at least from my more casual evidence, people who protested were protesting the economic conditions. A lot of the media broadcasts and some of the speakers, some of the leaders of this protest talked about the horrible, undemocratic nature of the Cuban government, and that got fed into the discourse through the social media, but also by some of the operatives who were being paid by U.S. government U.S. tax dollars to instigate something. As I said, several hundred people. It was quite unusual in Cuba, and the people I've talked to, can remember some of the protests that occurred during the 90s, during the special period, but not much has happened like that since. But it occurred, and it happened basically one day, and things went back to more or less normal after this. But as I said, the images of it were broadcast all around the world, but particularly in the U.S. And this had an impact on the Cuban American population, some of whom bought the message that this was about the authoritarian government in Cuba and the need to change it, even though if they talked to their relatives, they would have heard the story that I mentioned to you earlier, that people were really upset and distressed by the economic situation. Well, in a way, it was successful, but mobilizing a few hundred people on the streets, I've been involved in actions where that would have been a cause for self-congratulation. But you're talking about a population of over 11 million. And as I said, afterwards, there were some changes that took place trying to address some of the problems. But basically, there wasn't a huge threat to the government. Not long after July 11th, we started to have a flurry of social media posts. Actually, the dates kind of kept changing, but sometime in the fall there needs to be a huge demonstration, and we need to take power from the state, and basically a revolutionary call. The dates shifted a little bit because, as you might remember, 2021 was the period, where we were still struggling with COVID, and schools had been closed down in Cuba, were scheduled to open, as it turned out, on the November 15th. And so that was, in a way, the day they came up with to try to organize another mass action in Cuba. It didn't happen. I don't have the hard data to know why some of the people who came out on July 11th didn't, let alone why people who didn't come out on July 11th didn't. I do know, both from talking with with friends and colleagues and from some of the reports that came out, that people didn't see the problem being solved by going into the street, and particularly going into the streets and engaging in the violence that took place on July 11th. On July 11th, what didn't get reported in the US social media or national media very much, there are a few outlets that did, was there are actually many more pro-revolutionary folk out on the streets than there were protesting and calling for regime change, or even just objecting to the economic circumstances. But on November 15th, a group of youth called the Red Scarves organized a 4-day, I was going to call it a love-in. In some ways, it was a love-in. We are in San Francisco, so maybe that's the appropriate day. But they had 4 days of demonstrating their critical support of the revolutionary government and of the revolution. None of the people, I'm sure, would say that life was perfect, but many of them would say this is the revolution we and our ancestors fought for, and we want to keep it. And there's this one amazing portrait where, by the way, for those of you who only listen to mainstream media, you might be surprised to know that there isn't a Castro in the presidency, and hasn't been for years. But Miguel Diaz-Canel, who's pictured there with his mask on, which, again, it was November of 2021. He joined them, and of course, for them, it was an added dimension to their efforts. But this particular president, I think, even more so than during either Fidel's or Raul's administration, there are a lot more encounters at the local level going on. In part, I mean, he's trying to take over a revolutionary government that, he was born after it. And so it's not quite the same as being part of the group that carried out the revolution. But also, it's part of changes that took place during Raul Castro's government to try to encourage more participation, more decentralization. So there are shifts. And if you look at Cuba, it's not static. I mean, like any country, it's not static. I'm going to turn just real briefly. How much time do we have? Okay, well, this is good because I'll just briefly go through this. This is what I've summarized on one of the handouts, which you're welcome to. It has a lot of details. While the mainstream media doesn't give a lot of attention to it, there are a whole range of groups in the US who are committed to making changes in Cuba and educating people about Cuba and trying to encourage people to travel. Let me just ask, how many people have at one point or another traveled to Cuba? And my guess is over a number of years. So depending on when you travel there, I first traveled there in 93, which was during the special period. But I also lived in Cuba between 2017 and 2019 for 2 semesters. It wasn't continuous, but at 2 different semesters, I was a visiting professor at what is called the University of Pedagogical Sciences in Havana, or just outside of the Havana city. But there are a number of organizations that organize trips that try to influence U.S. government policy. I'll just mention a few of them and then talk a little bit more about the activities that have been going on. The National Network on Cuba, which is going to have its annual meeting on the 13th to the 15th. And I think that's down at the activities stage. It's a network of a whole range of organizations. I think at this point, it's 68 organizations. In my view, that's the good news. It's also the bad news. It means that we're really spread out and sometimes duplicating unnecessarily, but people are involved, and that to me is important. There's another organization that's become quite prominent nationally called the International U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition. And fortunately, they don't just try to summarize it as an acronym. It actually started in 2017 organizing a conference, trying to get people together to talk about Cuba, to involve people from the Cuban mission at the UN as a part of an exchange of ideas. And it kind of grew beyond just organizing the conference to, in a way, being a place every couple of weeks where Cuba solidarity activists come together to discuss what's going on and begin to organize some of the activities that are going on. In some ways, its functions overlap with the network, but it gives some people, other different people, a chance to assume leadership. Some of you may know about IFCO and Pastors for Peace. That was my first trip to Cuba in 93. And it does annually trips and also is involved in other kinds of organization. And finally, the Venceremos Brigade, which is the oldest group in the U.S. of traveling to Cuba. Their first trip was in 1969, so 10 years after the revolution. There were other less formal groups of people who've traveled to Cuba from 59 to 69, but Venceremos Brigade has done that. Up until recently, like Pastors for Peace, they traveled without the permission of the U.S. government, that is, without a license. In recent years, in part because of the opportunity to travel from the U.S. directly to a Cuban airport, and airlines won't let you on unless you identify your license, because they don't want to be fined for transporting illegal travelers to Cuba. So they've kind of changed their mode of operation, but still it's a solidarity group. And their next trip, I think both groups will be traveling next summer. And again, I've provided the websites if you're interested. I want to celebrate one accomplishment during 2021. Some of you may know that Cuba managed to develop 5 COVID vaccines. And to administer them not only to all of their citizens, except for a very few who might have a adverse allergic reaction, and distributed them in some cases free of charge, and in other cases at a much lower cost than your insurance companies have paid for your government-funded COVID vaccines that were developed here. But one of the things they faced in 2021 was a shortage of syringes. You know, vaccines are one thing, but if you don't have the shots, the syringes to inject them, it's not quite, you know, they didn't develop, except for one later, one that could be, you know, just consumed through the mouth. They needed syringes. So a group of us, various organizations, including the ones above, mobilized and collected enough donations from various people, from labor unions, from churches and other groups. And we were able to send 6 million of the 20 million syringes that were needed. They had 20 million, but they needed approximately 20 million more in order to be able to vaccinate their entire population. They developed a three-shot vaccine. So they needed more than if you're just going to do two. Although in hindsight, did we develop a two-shot vaccine in the US, or I'm just about to get my fourth? Anyway, that was a huge project. And I'll tell you, there are Cubans in every community I've visited since then who know about those syringes and are very thankful for that. Again, part of the problem that Cuba faced at the time was not only the international competition to try to find syringes. The US was having trouble getting them, and also many other countries, let alone in Africa and parts of Latin America. But also because of the blockade or embargo, they had fewer options, and they had limited financial opportunities, in part because of the SSOT. They can't get credit for purchasing things like all other countries, or most other countries around the world can. So they were stuck, and this was a help. There was a group in Europe and a group in Latin America who also provided some of them. And eventually they were able, actually, the day I arrived on November 15th of 2021, they had fully vaccinated, and that's why they were reopening the schools. Some of you may know that the San Francisco City Council has adopted a resolution condemning the embargo. That's happened in more than 100 different organizations or cities. And again, you can get access to that on the NNOC website, or I think also on the normalization website. An amazing variety of places, you know, on the East Coast and the West Coast, but also in the Midwest and in the South. And as I said, not just city councils, but in some cases state legislatures, and in some cases labor unions and other groups. I brought with me this petition. I don't know if it's circulating somewhere. The idea is to collect 1 million signatures. It's actually started by a group outside the US, but all the US organizations are supporting it. The idea is to bring 1 million signatures to the White House sometime in early December to document what people think should be the case with the SSOT. I should just insert here, for me, the craziness of putting Cuba on a list of state sponsors of terrorism, given that they've more often been the targets of state sponsors of terrorism, US government sponsors of terrorism, including invasion but also attempts to assassinate people and, bombs in hotels and a whole variety of terrorist activities that they've received, and the fact that they are sponsors. Why are they on the list? Trump argued, well, they are hosting members of the ELN, the Colombian National Liberation. Yeah. That was in Cuba as part of Cuba's agreement to negotiate a ceasefire and a resolution to the conflict. So they're in Cuba because Cuba stepped forward to solve a very difficult political problem, and Trump put that down as one of the main reasons why they should continue. They should be considered sponsors of terrorism. They also noted that Assata Shakur, that some of you undoubtedly know, is a resident of Cuba, and so they're harboring a terrorist. I'm not sure I would consider her to be a terrorist. I'd certainly consider her to be a political operative refugee that's in Cuba. But anyway, the point is, it's absurd that Cuba is on this list. And I might add, look at the list, and you might agree that some of the other countries listed, maybe all of them, shouldn't be on there and shouldn't be the target of U.S. sanctions as opposed to a UN. I'm just going to mention a few things happening locally. And again, I'll pass this out for those of you who are interested. In late September, there's going to be a human billboard, basically a silent protest in Oakland on October 6th, which maybe for some of you is a memorable date. It was a date that 30 years ago, no, 50 years ago, sorry. The U.S. funded operatives placed a bomb in Cubana 455 when it was taking off from one of the other Caribbean islands and coming back to Havana, had members of one of the athletic teams on it, all of whom were killed. So October 6th is shaping up to be an International Day Against Terrorism. And part of what we're going to be doing in the Bay Area is having a film, recently released film called, maybe appropriately, Cubana 455. And it's, you won't see the whole film, but you would see part of it, and there'll be discussion at that event. I mentioned the NNOC national meeting. It's something you can attend as an observer. Some of the groups you belong to may already be members of the NNOC. And then let me end with this major, what turns out to be a major, it's a national campaign or national tour of Liz Olivia Fernandez, who is a filmmaker, Cuban filmmaker, Afro-Cuban filmmaker, who has developed a series of film called Belly of the Beast. Some of you may have seen them. At these showings, she's going to share two of her most recent films, relatively short films, but powerful, and answer questions, discuss the situation in Cuba and U.S. policy. And you can see some of the possible times and places for it. What I thought was going to be one Bay Area event has exploded into more, but again, given transportation, and also obviously the university ones are targeting mainly students and faculty at those institutions, but I think are open to others. Let me just end by again thanking you for coming out on a Sunday morning, and I'm really looking forward to your questions or comments, as well as perhaps to see some of you at least become more active in trying to change U.S. policy toward Cuba, and or finding ways to travel to Cuba so that you can see that it's not a utopia, but you will feel really different than you do in the US, particularly if you happen to have a medical condition and don't have insurance, or if you want to go to an educational institution, higher education, postgraduate studies, and talk to the students and say, well, how are you going to deal with your mounting loan payments? And they'll look at you like you're from Mars, because education is free from preschool through higher education in Cuba. And let me just end with that. And again, thank you for being here.
This is a kind of global question, which maybe it can be threaded through some of the other more specific ones.
Okay.
How does Cuba rank in political rights with other countries? What is the U.S. policy toward countries similar to Cuba in terms of the levels of rights, political rights? That's a pretty global kind of question, but it's very germane to what you've been talking about. So that's, I'm just going to throw that one out rather than have you answer that.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind as I think about the others.
And here's one. Doesn't the U.S. realize that these efforts against Cuba turn the Cuban people against the U.S. and possibly drive them into the arms of Russia? Why not help them? So that's one you could start off with. Is a little more specific, and then the others are more specific.
Okay. Well, that question could have also been asked before 1991, and not about Russia, but about the Soviet Union. It's very clear that Cuba's close alliance with the Soviet Union was in large part a function not only of the Bay of Pigs invasion, but the U.S. continuing threats. It also, in my view, unfortunately, and a lot of Cuban colleagues and friends think similarly, that it also led to what's often called the missile crisis, or the October events in 1962. I think the real question today is how U.S. continued aggression toward Cuba is promoting much stronger relations with the People's Republic of China. And Cuba isn't the only country that is looking to China as an antidote or as an alternative to the U.S. And if the financial system gets in place, they definitely will. I can just give one example early on, even before China became as much of a economic force. In 1992, just after the special period started, after the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba lost about 75 to 85% of its trade partners, not with the U.S. at that point, with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The Chinese provided 1 million bicycles to Cuba. It's the one part of Cuba that I loved in 1993 that I don't see very much anymore. But again, it's one thing to ride a bike in San Francisco with hills, another thing to ride a bike on flat land in Cuba when you're in a much hotter and much more humid environment.
What is the influence of wealthy Cubans who fled Cuba during the revolution? on U.S. policy toward Cuba. I think that I might just say, what is that? What is the influence now as opposed to maybe earlier decades?
Well, there's continued to be a group of Cubans. As I mentioned, the polls suggest they're in a minority in terms of their view on Cuba relations, but they have very strong impact, in part because they're funded by the U.S. government programs, Radio and Jose Marti, in part because they'd like to get their property back. If they had stayed in Cuba, they'd still be occupying their property. I know a number of people who are living in the households of their parents and grandparents, because if you remained in Cuba, your house wasn't taken over by the government; it was yours. Similarly, with at least some of the big agricultural lands were broken up. Most of those owners actually fled, but in a few cases, when their land reform took place, they broke up some of the big holdings and distributed it to the population. So they do, and there are a few elected officials who are very much the voices of those who think that the regime should be changed. And to tell you the truth, as I suggested by that 1960 memo and a continuation, I think they've been much more successful than I and many of my colleagues have been in trying to shape policy. Obama administration might be the one exception. You can also look at the Carter administration having made some efforts, but for the most part, their voice is being reflected. I don't know how influential they are, as opposed to just that the two are parallel. I think there are reasons besides the Cuban American population that the U.S. wants to dominate Cuba, and has since the 18th century.
You mentioned corruption in the funding of Radio Marti. Do you have any comments on the support of Cuban cigar black marketers supporting the blockade?
I don't smoke, and I don't know much about that. Just to clarify, I didn't say there was corruption. I was saying that some of the people who receive the funds are those who are very outspoken against Cuba and are part of the political machine of right-wing Cuban Americans. That's the way I describe them. Who mobilize. So they're getting government funding in a way to support their organization to critique and to call for regime change in Cuba.
What do the EU countries think of the U.S. sanctions and blockade, and do they make any special efforts to trade with Cuba? The EU countries. Does the U.S. Threaten other countries that trade with Cuba? So that's kind of like a two-part thing.
Well, first, I think it's important to say that all of the EU countries, and I don't know if the EU has its separate vote in the UN General Assembly, but they have been part of the vote against the blockade for 29 times. They may have abstained on occasion. I'd have to go back to the records on that, but for the most part, certainly in recent years, they've voted against the blockade. It's a Cuban resolution condemning the blockade, and they supported that resolution. And they've also at times spoken out at the General Assembly on this. For the Europeans, the main thing they critique about the policy is the fact that it is extraterritorial. That is, it actually limits the ways in which companies in their country, might be subsidiaries of U.S. companies or otherwise, are blocked to do business with Cuba. But there is some business. I don't actually have the figures, so I'd have to look that up about how much trade there is. But those are indications. I wouldn't say the EU is voicing my view of how bad the embargo is or blockade is, but they certainly have voted in favor of the resolution presented by Cuba. As I said, mostly because it affects their population and their business owners.
How does education for children and young adults in Cuba address the issue of U.S.-Cuba relationship? And what is the impact of the messages to kids and young adults in Cuba?
There's some research on it. I can vaguely remember some that I read maybe a dozen years ago. I haven't seen anything recent. The curriculum is very explicit about the interventions of the U.S. Since 1898, and maybe even more detailed some of the actions of the U.S. government since 1959, since the revolution. It's part of a larger picture of what's going on in the world, and it, for example, pays attention to Africa in part because of Cuban important role in liberating South Africa, but also more generally, Cubans are my view is that Cubans, even in primary grade, are much more knowledgeable about the world than my grandsons are. My grandsons are great, but they've gone through a different kind of education system. I have to distinguish, though, and Cubans do this all the time when I meet with them. They talk about the difference between the U.S. population and the U.S. government. And it's sort of a refrain, we love you, the people, and we hate your government. And why don't you change it? And to tell you the truth, I say, well, maybe because it's not that easy, and maybe because we're not the ideal type democracy that sometimes we're claimed to be. But so they do learn. I don't think any young Cubans would walk out of their classroom thinking that all Americans are evil. I've walked into classrooms and people are excited to get to know me and ask questions. And, many of them have relatives in other parts of the U.S. So, part of it is their family lives in the U.S. But it also, they've met solidarity activists and religious and artistic folk who travel to Cuba. This is going back again to the Cuban Americans in Florida. Do they still determine U.S. policy toward Cuba? So I don't think we quite. I don't know if they determine it, but certainly their line is one that's in sync with the U.S. The idea that Florida is going to vote Democratic has been a dream of a number of national campaigns. And the idea, Cuban Americans in Florida are by no means a majority. They're a minority. They're quite powerful, some of them quite wealthy. But the idea that talking about Florida today is even more complicated. So I'll just stop at that point.
Florida's in, yes, right. We're all worried about Florida.
Yeah.
How does Cuba, this is going back to the initial question.
Okay.
About how does Cuba rank among other countries in the amount of political rights that its citizens have what is the US policy toward countries that are similar to Cuba in terms of assessing political rights?
I just wanted to add something to that question. Is like, could you address the outcome of the November 11th, like the protesters, the sentences they received? It comes for a lot of criticism. Just put it in front of that human rights policy.
Okay. First of all, unlike most people in the US, if you look internationally, human rights has different components. Civil or electoral related rights and social and economic rights. In the US, we generally tend to favor more the civil rights, the participation in elections and influence on the government. In Cuba, it's, human rights is often used as the big stick to criticize Cuba. I mean, certainly in terms of economic and social rights, I'd say they're at least as good, if not better, than the US. With regard to civil rights or voting rights and that, it's more complicated, in part because you have to understand how the Cuban political system works. And it's, there isn't, there isn't in the US either, direct election of the president, but it's more indirect. There is an electoral college. They have municipal elections, which then elect people at the provincial level, and then the provincial folk do a national assembly, and the National Assembly elects the president. So do they have more rights to shape who the president is? I don't know. I'll ask you how much influence you have over who's the president, but it's an indirect process, and we have to recognize that. And it functions, and it has led to some changes. I mean, the new president was elected through that process, but so was Raul Castro, and so was Fidel Castro. The thing for me that is more important in terms of civil rights is how people like us are involved in shaping major issues. So, for example, Cuba just recently, about a year and a half ago, adopted what was called the Family's Code. Some of you may have heard of this. It's a very progressive code that recognizes people of different genders and allows, legalizes families that are of different sorts, including people who have different genders, but also, grandparents and others that can be considered legal family units. That took place as a result of literally hundreds of local conversations, discussions, debates among the citizenry before it went to the National Assembly and before it went to a national referendum.
That's amazing.
I'll leave it at that. We can talk more maybe during the coffee.
Do you want us to end? There's one more question here. Okay.
Okay.
What would you say to a quote average activist like me, this person being that person there, who signs every petition and gives money to organizations, but as you've shown, nothing has changed in regard to, I guess, US Cuba in the last 30 plus years. As with gun control, majority's opinions is ignored. Or is it ignored? I guess maybe is majority opinion ignored?
I don't have the direct evidence, but I have to believe that the Obama administration, in part, and I think also to some extent the Carter administration, although it didn't carry out what it was trying to do because of some events that took place that kind of deflected that energy. I think that was partly a result to popular organization. You'll have to remember that, just before he did that, there were two huge campaigns to free the Cuba Five, the Cubans who were delegated to come to the U.S. and try to infiltrate anti-Cuban groups, not U.S. government organizations, but NGOs basically, but who were sometimes carrying out violent attacks and certainly had threatened to do so. They got arrested and some of them served long terms, but the population in the US and around the world mobilized, and eventually they were released. And in fact, the final person, the fifth person, was released just after Obama traveled to Cuba and opened up normal relations, not normal relations, more normalized relations, anything but normal. Will this campaign to end the SSOT make a difference? In my view, the question is, what is our option? I mean, at the moment, Biden may be sitting there with an idea that nobody really cares, or nobody really is against them placing it on. I mean, I don't know where he got that rumor, but certainly there's good effort. And I think the best idea that the people organizing to change Cuba policy are potentially powerful are the Republicans in the House and the Senate who are trying to push through this Force Act. I mean, they think it could happen that we could get to Biden and his administration to take Cuba off the list. Otherwise, why would they, I don't want to say waste time, but why would they invest the energy to legislate something that is an executive action that they don't think could be changed? So I owe it to not just my fellow solidarity activists, but to my Cuban friends and colleagues to keep up the struggle. And I hope you do whatever you can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ginsburg. Before we close, I just want to mention a couple of coming attractions. So do come back next Sunday. We'll be having this presentation. It's part of our Dangerous Truth series. And Dolores has arranged for a historian, I believe she's a historian, Jean Felser, and she's going to talk about the unknown history of California as a slave state. So that's going to be fascinating. And then 2 weeks from today, we have Tim Paulson coming to present. He's going to talk about Occupy SF 10 years later. And also on that same date, which is October 8th, will be The Blessing of the Animals, which is a project that Dolores is very involved in. And then we'll have a couple of weeks off from Forum, but more in November. So please come back. Great to see you all. Oh, and if you didn't get a chance to sign the petition to take Cuba off the SSOT, please think of doing that before you leave today. Thank you very much.